Welcome to the MacArthur Memorial Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Williams. Join me as we explore the life and legacy of General of the Army Douglas MacArthur and discuss a wide range of military history topics, from the American Civil War to the Korean War. A lot of our listeners will be familiar with John D. Bulkeley, the PT boat captain who spirited MacArthur and his family off of Corregidor. Bulkeley received the Silver Star for his role in that escape, and he was also a recipient of the Medal of Honor for extraordinary heroism, distinguished service, and conspicuous gallantry above and beyond the call of duty as commander of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 in Philippine waters during the period from December 7th, 1941 to April 10th, 1942. Bulkeley's life and service are just incredible, and today we're going to not be talking about his service in the Pacific. We're going to be talking about his service during the invasion of Normandy. And we are joined by John Long, Director of Education at the National D-Day Memorial in Bedford, Virginia. Well, welcome, sir. Thank you for coming back to the podcast.
Thank you, man. It's great to be here. I appreciate the invitation.
To start us off, what sort of man was John Bulkeley?
I have very much enjoyed getting to know him a bit, and I ran across one story that I thought must encapsulate a lot of his personality. It was in 1940, before the U.S. is in the war. PT boats were still a very new technology, and Bulkeley was in charge of a squadron down in Florida or somewhere in that vicinity, and received word that his PT boats were to be transferred to Britain as part of Lend-Lease. And his orders were to take them to New York City for the transfer. So figuring this is his chance to try out this new technology, maybe help to write the book about what you do with PT boats, he decided they would just put them through the ringer on this trip up the seaboard of the United States, going full speed, going through storms, just seeing how much of a beating that these things can take, and of course, keeping notes so that they could pass this information on. They got to Norfolk and stopped there at the naval base to refuel for the last leg on up to New York. And the story is that they pulled into Norfolk and just moored at a convenient spot to refuel. And his crew by then are worn out. They've been buffeted by bad weather and the speed of these boats, and they did not realize it, but they stopped in view of the office of Admiral Ernest King, who was the commander of the Atlantic Fleet at that time, and very much a stickler who was not afraid to bite people's heads off. So they are lounging on the deck of their PT boats, and a sharply dressed Navy lieutenant comes up to them and says, need to speak to the commanding officer. So Bulkeley goes up to him and says, you are required to appear in Admiral King's office in your dress uniform in, I forget the time, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and then promptly turned and left. And Bulkeley thought, now what do I do here? Because I don't have a dress uniform. I'm on this sea trial, just delivering some PT boats. I certainly don't want to get in trouble. And then something occurred to him. The Navy lieutenant had never asked his name. And so all Ernest King knew was that there was some, slovenly looking bunch of sailors out here. So he said, okay, guys, get ready. We're leaving. And they just left Norfolk and left Ernest King, no doubt, to rage about this lieutenant who had stood him up. And I think that, as I say, encapsulates much of his personality. He was also a stickler for the rules, but he was not afraid to bend them when it made sense. And he was very much on the side of his sailors, the men who served beneath him during his whole career, whether it's in the Philippines, in European theater, or later in Korea, Vietnam. They loved this man, and they were willing to do what was necessary for him, and he returned that love to them.
Yeah, he was a pretty incredible person, I think, and a leader. I always think about the story where he takes the MacArthurs off of Corregidor, and there's some people that look at him that day. And I mean, he's been in a lot of combat. He's been in this PT boat engaging, Japanese destroyers, doing just these incredible exploits. And he doesn't have a proper uniform on anymore. And, he has a beard. He's got maybe a bandana and he's got like pearl handled revolvers with him. And people are a little concerned that maybe this is not the best person to get MacArthur and his family out of here safely. He looks like a pirate, is what Mrs.
Mhm.
MacArthur says. But I think MacArthur takes one look at him and just, from the beginning, I think he always wanted Bulkeley to be the person that took them out of there. But I didn't know that Ernest King story. And here we are in Norfolk, Virginia. And what a great story. So,
Exactly.
all right. So, how does Bulkeley end up in the European theater of operations then? Is it because of the transfer of these PT boats?
In part, and of course, he was awarded the Medal of Honor, and so he returned stateside to receive his medal from President Roosevelt himself. Then did a lot of what we would consider PR appearances, sold war bonds, just trying to raise awareness and support for the war. And he was, again, a Medal of Honor winner at this point in the war. There weren't very many of them yet. And so he got a lot of attention wherever he went, met a number of famous people, including, incidentally, Joseph Kennedy, who had been the ambassador to England beforehand. And Joseph Kennedy said, I would like you to meet my son and tell him about PT boats. And that son, of course, was John F. Kennedy. And I think probably a lot of the listeners, if they know anything about PT boats, they know the story of Kennedy and PT 109, which that story helped, of course, to launch his political and ultimately presidential career. But after all of that, he was sent back to the Pacific for a brief while, but contracted malaria, like so many people in the Pacific did, and came back to the United States to recuperate. And it was at that point afterwards that after recuperating that, he was told, we want you to go to Europe and prepare PT boat operations for the what was then still in planning, but was the inevitable cross-channel invasion that had to happen.
What role do the PT boats operating then in the English Channel play, though, prior to the invasion, prior to D-Day?
The English Channel was, of course, a battleground long before D-Day. It was where there were naval skirmishes, there was air combat between Germany and England and their allies, and PT boats in the Channel served very important roles, often, certainly patrolling the channel and keeping the sea lanes open, but also often running supplies and even people, operatives to France and deposited them there for the French resistance. And John Bulkeley did a number of those ventures. He also recalled later a time he was sent for what he thought was completely nonsensical to this beach in the middle of nowhere on the Cherbourg Peninsula and told to bring back buckets of sand. And he wondered, why are they risking my life and the life of my men and my PT boats to get buckets of sand? He didn't know that, of course, that was to gauge the suitability of what becomes Utah Beach for an invasion. It had to support armor. It couldn't be a swamp. And so I later understood what he was doing. But he was, again, very diligent and very supportive of his sailors and protective of his boats. And yet they accomplished their mission of keeping the Germans away. The German equivalent of PT boats were called E-boats, Schnellboote in German, and they terrorized very often shipping in the channel. He helped to keep them at bay. It's another story I ran across of just before D-Day, about a month before or so, and he was invited to dinner at a big fancy house. And as a Medal of Honor recipient, that often happened to him. People wanted to rub elbows with him. So he went to this dinner to discover that in attendance was Winston Churchill and King George VI. And so he got to speak with both and get to know them. And it wasn't long after that that they requested to go on a tour of the fleet that was gathering down in the channel. And his PT boat was chosen to ferry Prime Minister and the King of England. through the English Channel. And that was an encounter certainly none of his sailors ever forgot.
So, a little bit earlier, you mentioned the German E-boats. There's a lot of training that goes into preparing for the invasion at Normandy. Tell us about a disaster that occurs off Slapton Sands, and how does that influence planning for D-Day, particularly in terms of the role of the PT boat?
And this is a very fitting subject because we've just passed, not long ago, the 80th anniversary of the disaster at Slapton Sands, Operation or Exercise Tiger, rather, it was called. It was a training exercise specifically for men of the 4th Division who were going to land at Utah Beach, which had only recently been added to the invasion plan to land Allied troops and specifically an American division, as well as 2 divisions of paratroopers on the Cherbourg Peninsula. And Slapton Sands, the region there in Devon on the English Channel, had been chosen because the terrain resembled Utah Beach. We certainly wanted to keep this from the Germans because anyone kind of thinking about it might say, well, why are they staging practice landings there? What in France is a lot like Slapton Sands? Maybe the invasion is coming soon and it's coming at Utah Beach, or at least part of it. And so this was intended to be a complete secret, but at night, while they are staging their practice landings, German Schnellboote, E-boats, sneak in amongst the landing fleet and torpedo ultimately 3 LSTs, 2 sunk, 1 heavily damaged. And landing ship tanks were also essential for this invasion to get the troops and supplies ashore, not so much on D-Day, but in following days. It couldn't happen because we're not going to have a port. We've got to have these large cargo ships like the LSTs. Then the fact that 3 of them were lost, 750 American soldiers and sailors, meant that possibly the secret had gotten out. Did the Germans realize what had happened? Had they captured someone from the water or even just recovered a body with information about the invasion on it? Is the entire invasion in jeopardy now? After a few days, and especially when the officers who had been killed in the attack and who had detailed information, their bodies were recovered, so we could rest assured that the Germans hadn't captured them. They realized that, okay, we're going to go ahead, but we need to make some changes. And one of them was incorporating more PT boats into the early stages to keep the German E-boats away from the landing beaches. And there was a German E-boat pin at Cherbourg on the peninsula just north of Utah Beach. And we also added rescue boats from the Coast Guard. They did better lifeboat training and certainly better communication among the Allied ships to make this happen. So what happened at Slapton Sands was a disaster, but if anything could be said to come from it that was good, it helped prepare for the invasion.
What are Bulkeley's invasion orders for D-Day?
He is in command of a flotilla of PT boats, and his job is multiple jobs that are going on D-Day itself. First of all, in about the 24 hours before D-Day, his PT boats are helping to protect the minesweepers that are clearing the paths into Utah Beach. There's other PT boats around the other landing beaches, but his station was around Utah. And that was absolutely essential because obviously if anything's going to stop this invasion, it could be those mines, or it could be the E-boats if they could get into the flotilla and hit a few of these troop transports as well. And so their secondary job was to protect the landings from the German E-boats. And then, of course, respond to any other changing circumstances. For instance, rescuing survivors if necessary. If an Allied ship is sunk, they can help to pick up those who are still in the water. And so he is in command of Patrol Torpedo Boat Squadron 102 that ultimately finds a sort of anticlimactic D-Day. The protection of the minesweepers, as I said, was essential, and it actually was marked by the first Allied losses in the invasion on June 5th, 1944. And an American minesweeper called the Osprey hit a mine in trying to clear the path and went down very quickly with the loss of 6 American lives. Who were the first men to die, not on D-Day, because it's still a few hours before, but in the invasion itself. And it was Bulkeley's PT boats that helped pick up the survivors from the Osprey disaster. Ultimately, on D-Day itself, the PT boats have sort of an anticlimax in a lot of ways. They were prepared for, maybe close contact with the enemy, with the E-boats, maybe chasing German submarines. And it turns out very little of that happened. Bulkeley's Torpedo Boat Squadron 102 forms what's called the Mason Line, which protects the beaches. And ultimately, the German E-boats just don't show up for whatever reason. The German admiral in charge did not deploy those boats. Maybe he thought it was too risky for them against such a massive fleet. But they end up patrolling the area and protecting it from an enemy that doesn't show up. Now, if that is, as I say, a little bit anticlimactic, it does still pay some dividends because it keeps them at bay. So maybe the deterrence of the PT boats was as important as anything they could have done. But they also helped to pick up a lot of survivors. The USS Rich, the USS Glennon, some American destroyers that hit mines and are sunk. Many of those men are rescued by the PT boats.
So after D-Day, Bulkeley finds himself in the Mediterranean for the invasion of southern France. Tell us about his role here.
Not long after D-Day, he is promoted and given command of a destroyer, which I picture him taking that with a little bit of regret because he was saying farewell to his beloved patrol boats. But he took over command of the destroyer, the USS Endicott, and headed down to the Mediterranean to be part of Operation Dragoon, the invasion in southern France. And his role there and the Endicott's role is also kind of interesting because it's really a diversion. Some Navy officers had been given the job of making the Germans think the main attack was going to come elsewhere, very similar to what was happening before D-Day with the Operation Fortitude and what was happening later in the fight through France with the famous Ghost Army. Well, there was a naval equivalent down in the Mediterranean where they wanted to make the Germans think we were going to launch the main invasion around La Ciotat. And I cannot pronounce anything French, so I apologize to anyone who can. But they shelled this place. They dropped dummy paratroopers and sunk a German, I think it was a merchant ship, to make them think this is where the invasion is happening, when in fact it was happening elsewhere, the main body of it. But it leads to a brief little skirmish that is in many ways one of John Bulkeley's most famous days and most celebrated days. The Endicott has been firing shore bombardment, really, so much so that they had overheated almost all but one of their guns. They'd had some damage. They were hit by a German shell at one point during this Battle of La Ciotat. And then some of the small gunboats, patrol boats, and then some other smaller British gunboats were under attack by German forces. And Bulkeley decides the Endicott is coming to their rescue. And so they steam up close and begin firing with the one gun that is still operational, and ultimately are able to protect the British ships and chase the Germans out, sink some Germans, and they're able to also rescue German sailors from the water. A number of prisoners of war, and that's always of importance intelligence, advantage to capture POWs. And so they win this day, and although it was really only a small skirmish, not ultimately all that significant in the victory in the Mediterranean, it was one of the finest days of his career. And he was asked afterwards by a reporter why he would do such a thing. Why would you, a single ship, already damaged, only one operating gun, why would you attack two enemy vessels? And here's what he said, which I think, again, captures a lot of his personality. Quote, "What else could I do? You engage, you fight, you win. That is the reputation of our Navy then and in the future." And I think that's a great recruiting slogan for the U.S. Navy. He goes on then afterwards to continue his career, ends up back stateside, and I think that was a little bit anticlimactic for him as well, that the fight went on with him really doing a desk job and some PR jobs back in the United States. But he remains in the Navy the rest of his career, serves very important posts, ultimately retires as a vice admiral, serves in the Korean War, serves in the Vietnam era. He is in command of Guantanamo Bay during some of the standoff there with Cuba, and ends up with just a great career that fostered the careers of many other naval veterans who are going to come after him.
So, final thoughts, and please tell us what the memorial up there in Bedford is going to be doing for the 80th anniversary of D-Day as well.
Oh, absolutely. As we record this, we are coming up on June 6th for the 80th anniversary. And it will be, of course, an opportunity for us to pull out all the stops and honor the last of the World War II veterans. We have quite a few registered to be with us that day. And by quite a few, I think we're up to about 16 or 17 right now. And given that most World War II veterans are over 100 at this point, and of course, the vast majority of them have passed on, to have those representatives of the greatest generation with us will be the highlight of the day. But we will, of course, mark the anniversary with proper ceremony, with patriotic music, with all the pomp and circumstance, as well as we'll have living history displays on site. We are bringing in an actual Higgins boat, LCVP, such as was used on D-Day for people to see. We will have a flyover of World War II aircraft and a number of well-known dignitaries, authors, political figures who will join us as well. On June 7th and 8th, we'll have a very spectacular immersive light show at the memorial. We'll turn the memorial itself into the screen for this very impressive presentation based on a poem about Omaha Beach, with all the images and the words of the participants. And it will be a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Well, twice in a lifetime, because we're doing it twice, I guess. But it's nothing that we can duplicate afterwards, because it uses the actual memorial as the backdrop, as the screen for this projection. So I encourage everyone to check out our webpage, look at the schedule of events, and get your tickets for that light show on the 7th and the 8th, because again, it's something you can probably watch it, some version of it on YouTube afterwards, but it's not going to be the same. You have to really see it there in its full scope to get the full awareness of what this is and how great a tribute it's going to be.
I had the privilege of being up there in Bedford with you all about a month ago, and been a long time since I'd been up there, but I really recommend, if anybody can get up there for that 80th anniversary event, or if you can just plan a trip there sometime afterwards, it is definitely worth a visit. And the staff up there at the National D-Day Memorial does an incredible job of keeping these stories alive and sharing them with the rest of us. So,
And I'll add in on behalf of the World War II Heritage Alliance in Virginia, of which the MacArthur Memorial, the National D-Day Memorial, and many other places are members. You can learn a lot about the Second World War by visiting these sites in Virginia.
Virginia is a great place to see some amazing collections and to visit some incredible museums. So, again, thank you, John, so much for taking the time today. And I hope that we'll be able to talk to you again soon. Maybe we need to make this an annual D-Day thing.
Oh, absolutely. I appreciate the invitation and opportunity to chat for a while about a very interesting naval officer.
Thank you for listening. If you have questions, suggestions, or comments, we want to hear from you. You can find us on Twitter at MacArthur1880, on Facebook as the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial, or you can email MacArthurMemorial@norfolk.gov.